What if everything you believed about Meghan Markle's struggle story, the rags-to-riches narrative that inspired millions, wasn't true? What if the world's most famous duchess wasn't a poor girl clawing her way from obscurity, but the daughter of a Hollywood professional who gave her everything she ever asked for? And what if the man she erased from her story, her own father, has finally had enough of the lies? Thomas Markle sits in silence for a moment before the interview begins. The cameras roll, the lights hum softly, and he looks straight ahead, not angry, not bitter, but tired. Tired of being painted as the villain in a story he says he helped write from the very beginning. "I stayed silent for too long," he murmurs, his voice gravelly, worn. But lies have expiration dates. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. There's something chilling about that line. Lies have expiration dates. And tonight, according to Thomas Markle, Meghan's version of her life, the struggling actress, the abandoned daughter, the survivor of poverty and neglect, is about to expire. You can feel it already, can't you? That uneasy tingle when the story you thought you knew starts to unravel. Because Meghan's tale wasn't just about hardship. It was her brand, the foundation of her global appeal. The story of a woman who rose from nothing to royalty, armed with nothing but grit, talent, and determination. It made people root for her. It made her relatable, sympathetic, inspiring. But what if, behind that perfect narrative, there was comfort, privilege? A father who paid for private schooling, vacations, and opportunities most kids could only dream of? Thomas shakes his head slowly. "She wasn't poor," he says. "Not even close. I worked long hours to make sure she never had to struggle. I paid for everything, the private school, her clothes, even her trips to set. I wanted her to have a life I never had. And for years, she thanked me for it. Until it didn't fit her story anymore." That's the moment the audience leans in. Because every great fall from grace starts the same way, with a story that no longer fits the truth. Let's rewind. Picture Meghan as a child in Los Angeles. Not the glitzy red carpet version, but the suburban one. School uniforms, clean sneakers, a loving dad who worked behind the scenes in television. Thomas Markle wasn't a failed dreamer. He was an Emmy-winning lighting director for major Hollywood shows. He made enough to send his daughter to private schools, pay for theater lessons, and help her chase every creative whim. This wasn't a story of struggle. It was a story of support, until it became inconvenient. So why did Meghan change the story? Why erase the man who made her childhood comfortable? Why recast herself as the underdog when her own father says she never wanted for anything? These are the questions hanging in the air as Thomas speaks. His eyes don't dart or waver. He's not performing. He's confessing. "She learned early on how people respond to emotion," he says quietly. "She knew how to smile through pain, even when it wasn't hers. She was smart, strategic, always aware of who was watching." And right there, that's the twist. Thomas isn't describing cruelty. He's describing calculation. A girl rehearsing empathy the way others rehearse lines. A daughter who understood that performance wasn't just a job, it was a weapon. Was Meghan Markle performing long before she ever stepped in front of a royal camera? Was every hardship anecdote, every tearful interview, another act in the script of her life? The contradiction is mesmerizing. A woman celebrated for her authenticity, accused of fabricating her own struggle. A father once cherished as her hero, now recast as her oppressor. Fame has a way of rewriting memory, doesn't it? Especially when sympathy sells better than gratitude. Thomas looks down at his hands. "She told the world she paid her own way through school," he says. "That she worked at a frozen yogurt shop, that she struggled to afford acting lessons. But I paid for everything. Every penny. I wanted her to have choices. I gave her those choices. So why pretend you had none?" That question lingers like smoke. It's not bitterness that drives his tone. It's disbelief. The kind of disbelief that comes from realizing your love has been weaponized against you. You can almost see it. The father reading interviews where his daughter claims she grew up poor, the tabloids turning him into a scapegoat, the silence between them growing louder. And for years, he kept quiet, perhaps hoping she'd reach out, hoping the truth would correct itself. But silence has limits, and Thomas has reached his. Let's be honest, the world wanted to believe Meghan's version. It's the better story. A biracial girl from a broken home, fighting her way into Hollywood, defying the British establishment. It's cinematic, emotional, marketable. The media loves a self-made heroine. But reality? It's rarely that neat. Behind every spotlight, there's a shadow, and Thomas is now stepping out of his. He recalls her early years, private Catholic school, acting workshops, photos of vacations in Hawaii. She was happy, he insists. She wasn't suffering. I made sure she didn't. And then, almost whispering, but maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I made it too easy. It's a tragic irony. The man accused of neglect is the one who gave too much. The father branded as toxic for speaking out was once the provider who gave her the comfort she would later erase. And that's the emotional contradiction at the core of this story. The same love that built her story became the foundation she had to destroy to look like a survivor. But this isn't just about money or privilege. It's about identity. Meghan's transformation, from girl next door to global duchess, required reinvention. And reinvention demands a clean slate. Old truths had to be trimmed, reshaped, reimagined. Poverty became a metaphor. Struggle became a brand. Doesn't that sound familiar? The Hollywood formula: rise, fall, redemption. Only this time, the fall was a rewrite, a creative choice. Thomas shakes his head again, tired. She used to call me every week, he says. We'd talk for hours. She'd tell me about auditions, ask for advice, laugh about bad scripts. Then suddenly, nothing. No calls, no texts, just silence. And then I started seeing my name in headlines. That's how I knew I'd been replaced, by her new story. Imagine that. Learning from the media that you're the villain in your own child's narrative. Watching the world celebrate a version of your daughter that no longer resembles the one you raised. That's not just betrayal. That's emotional erasure. And it worked. The world believed her. The charity speeches, the interviews about humble beginnings, the tears, it all played perfectly. Meghan became the symbol of resilience, a modern Cinderella. But behind that fairy tale, her father sat alone, watching interviews where she described struggling to survive, wondering where exactly in their comfortable California home that struggle ever took place. Thomas doesn't raise his voice, but the pain seeps through every word. I was proud of her, he says. Still am, in a way. But I can't stay silent while she builds her image on lies. It's not about fame. It's about truth. And that's where the story pivots. This isn't just a father exposing his daughter. It's a man reclaiming his place in a story that cast him out. It's personal, raw, uncomfortable. Because behind the glitz of royal titles and Netflix deals, there's still a father who wants to be believed. Thomas recalls moments from her youth, birthdays, school plays, the night he framed her first photo on a TV set. She used to look at the lights and say, "That's where I belong, Dad." I thought she meant Hollywood. I didn't realize she meant the spotlight itself. That line stings. The spotlight itself. It wasn't about acting, it was about attention. And that, perhaps, is the heart of Thomas's revelation. That Meghan's hunger for the spotlight began long before royalty, and that it demanded a story dramatic enough to keep her there. But every performance has a cost. And in this one, the cost was family. So why now? Why speak after years of silence? Thomas looks into the camera. Because I'm tired of pretending. Tired of watching my name used as a prop in a story I didn't write. She told the world she was alone. That's not true. She pushed everyone away who could say otherwise. His eyes glisten, and for a moment, he's not the bitter father tabloids mocked. He's just a man who lost his daughter to fame. Then the contradiction hits hardest. The woman who preached about compassion, empathy, and family unity built her empire by rejecting her own father. The activist for kindness erased the man who raised her. The humanitarian left her own blood behind. It's not about hate, it's about truth. And truth, as Thomas says, doesn't vanish just because it's inconvenient. He leans back, sighs. She used to say, "Dad, one day people will know my story." I guess she was right. They just won't know the real one. Pause. The silence after that line feels heavy, final. You can almost hear the tension in the room. Because this isn't just a story of celebrity. It's a story of transformation and the casualties left behind. A daughter becomes a duchess. A father becomes a ghost. And between them, a truth too messy for fairy tales. Thomas looks straight into the lens, voice steady but cold. She used to call me her hero. Now I'm her enemy. Why? Because I know too much. The lights dim. The sound fades. And just before the screen cuts to black, one final line hovers like a chill. But what he reveals next will change how you see Meghan Markle forever. And no one saw it coming. It always starts with a story. Every empire, every public image, every fairy tale the world falls in love with begins with a story. But what happens when that story isn't true? When the foundation of a person's fame is built not on reality, but on reinvention. Meghan Markle's rags to riches fairy tale has inspired millions across the globe. A girl who supposedly clawed her way from poverty and obscurity to become a duchess. But as her father Thomas Markle quietly says, that story was never real. Not for 1 second. That's the hook. And tonight, we're pulling the first thread. Imagine this. The world's cameras flashing, Meghan smiling softly as she tells the world how she struggled to make it in Hollywood. How she worked from the bottom. How she paid her own way through school. The story of a young girl with big dreams and empty pockets. It's emotional. It's cinematic. It's the kind of story that sells books, wins sympathy, and commands headlines. But Thomas Markle shakes his head and says one thing that changes everything. I paid for everything. She never went without. Not once. You can feel the tension in that sentence. It's not anger, it's hurt. It's disbelief. Because to Thomas, this wasn't just a lie, it was an erasure. He remembers the long days on television sets, working as a lighting director, coming home exhausted but proud that his daughter could go to private school. Immaculate Heart, he says, the name catching in his throat. That's not a cheap school. That's not a struggling family's school. I paid those bills. Every semester. Every activity. I made sure she had the best education I could give her. So why did Meghan claim otherwise? That question becomes the heartbeat of this chapter. The contradiction between public image and private truth. The difference between self-made and supported. Thomas leans back, lost in memory. She had nice clothes, vacations, friends, tutors. I wasn't rich, but I made good money. I worked hard so she didn't have to struggle. I gave her everything I could. The words hang in the air. They're simple, but devastating. And yet, years later, Meghan would tell millions of viewers about working odd jobs to survive, about scraping by, about humble beginnings. She said she paid for acting school. She said she hustled to pay the bills. Thomas scoffed softly. She didn't pay for that. I did. And I have the receipts. It's not the money that stings him. It's the rewriting. The idea that the daughter he adored reinvented herself into a victim, and in doing so, erased him from her story. Why does that matter? Because every public figure builds a brand, and Meghan's brand wasn't built on royalty. It was built on relatability. The world didn't just love her because she married a prince. They loved her because she seemed like one of them. The girl next door who defied odds. The outsider who conquered an institution. It was perfect. Almost too perfect. Let's pause here and ask, does truth even matter when the story feels good? Think about it. The global media wanted the Meghan Markle narrative to be clean and inspiring. A mixed-race woman from humble beginnings breaks barriers in the British monarchy. It's a story that writes itself. It's also the kind of story that no one wants to fact-check, because it feels right. It fits the mood of the moment, the underdog, the outsider, the changemaker. But as Thomas says, the truth doesn't care about what fits. He recalls her childhood in vivid detail. Family dinners, laughter, school plays. She was always confident, always well-dressed, always had her head held high, he says. She wasn't struggling. She was thriving. The irony burns deeper the more he speaks. Because while Meghan told the world she fought her way out of hardship, her father's version paints a very different picture, one of stability, comfort, and opportunity. He reaches for a faded photo. Meghan in her school uniform, smiling. This is not a picture of poverty, he mutters. That's a private school kid. I worked overtime for that smile. You can almost feel the conflict between father and daughter pulsing through time. One sees truth as honesty. The other, perhaps, sees truth as branding. And that's the real twist. Maybe Meghan didn't lie out of malice. Maybe she lied out of necessity. In a world where sympathy sells, struggle becomes currency. Thomas seems to understand this, even if it breaks him. I think she learned early on that people respond to pain, he says quietly. She saw how being vulnerable, even if it wasn't real, made people lean in. And once you start down that road, it's hard to stop. That's the cold reality of celebrity storytelling. You can't inspire millions with comfort. You inspire them with struggle, whether it's true or not. Still, Thomas refuses to stay silent any longer. I'm not doing this to hurt her, he insists. I just want people to know I was there, that I cared, that she didn't grow up in some broken, starving world. She had love. She had support. She had me. That line lands like a confession. Because in the end, this isn't about fame or fortune. It's about a father watching his daughter erase the parts of her life that prove she wasn't alone. Let's pull back for a moment and look at how this story was built. When Meghan first entered the royal spotlight, her team pushed this self-made angle hard. Media outlets ran features calling her the girl who fought her way up. Publicists emphasized her working-class roots. Even the Netflix series Harry and Meghan painted her early life as modest, humble, almost impoverished. But behind the scenes, Thomas sat in Mexico, watching those headlines, stunned. Working class, he repeats. I worked in Hollywood. She was on sets with me as a kid. She had access most people could only dream about. He's right. This isn't just speculation. Thomas Markle won 2 Daytime Emmy Awards for his work. He wasn't a laborer struggling for wages. He was part of the Hollywood system that gave Meghan her first taste of lights, cameras, and attention. In other words, she wasn't climbing from the gutter. She was climbing from a studio lot. So why pretend otherwise? Thomas thinks he knows. Because it sounds better, he says. The poor girl who made it. That's a better story than the privileged one who wanted more. That's the painful paradox. A daughter turning privilege into poverty for applause. And yet, Thomas still softens when he talks about her. He can't help it. She was always ambitious, he admits. Always wanted to be more. I admired that. I never wanted to stop her. But ambition changes people. It changes what they're willing to remember. That's the tragedy. The man who supported her success became the proof she needed to bury. Do you see the pattern yet? Every self-made myth in Hollywood has a price. Meghan's price was her father's reputation. Thomas remembers a time before it all changed. We used to talk about her dreams, he says. She wanted to be famous. But she also wanted to be loved. Somewhere along the line, she mixed the two up. It's a haunting reflection, and one that sets the stage for everything that follows. Because this isn't just a daughter rewriting her past. It's a woman constructing a brand powerful enough to reshape reality. Thomas picks up another photo, Meghan's teenage years. Smiling, confident, middle-class Los Angeles behind her. That's who she really was, he says softly. Not the struggling actress. Not the poor little girl. She was happy. She was cared for. She was mine. There's a pause. You can almost feel his pride wrestling with his pain. Then comes the gut punch, the contradiction that cuts deepest. When she told the world she worked hard to pay her way, I laughed, he says. Not because it was funny, because I was the one sending the checks. The irony is cruel. The father funding her dreams became invisible the moment those dreams became profitable. And that's where the larger question arises. What's more important to a public figure? Truth or image? In Meghan's case, image always won. Because this struggling girl, narrative gave her moral power. It made her untouchable. Criticize her. And you weren't just criticizing a duchess. You were attacking a survivor. Thomas sighs, almost defeated. She built a wall of sympathy, he says. And I wasn't part of the design. There's no venom in his tone, only sorrow. I'm not angry she became successful, he continues. I'm proud she made something of herself. I just wish she didn't have to destroy the truth to do it. And with that, you realize something haunting. This story isn't about revenge. It's about regret. A father watching his daughter become someone he no longer recognizes, and wondering when honesty stopped being enough. The chapter slows as Thomas reflects on what might have been. If she had told the truth, he says quietly, people would have still loved her. They would have respected her. She didn't need to pretend to be poor. She just needed to be real. But authenticity doesn't sell like fantasy. And Meghan, perhaps, understood that better than anyone. The camera lingers on Thomas as he looks off screen. Every lie comes with a price, he says finally. And hers hasn't been paid yet. He's not threatening. He's warning. Because what comes next, the proof, the letters, the receipts, the public fallout, will push this story from rumor to revelation. The lie that built her brand is about to collapse. And no one, not even Meghan, can control what happens when the truth finally takes the microphone. But what Thomas reveals next will turn everything upside down. And no one saw it coming. Before the palaces, before the red carpets, before the crown and the controversy, there was just a father and his daughter, Thomas and Meghan. Two people, inseparable once upon a time. Before fame twisted affection into silence, before public image replaced private love. It's hard to imagine now, with all the noise, the bitterness, and the accusations, that their story began in warmth. But it did. Thomas remembers it vividly. "She was my little bean," he says, smiling faintly. "That's what I called her, my bean. She used to sit on my lap while I watched the news. Always curious. Always asking questions. She wanted to know how everything worked." It's an image that doesn't fit the cold narrative of estrangement. A hard-working father, sitting in a modest California living room, his little girl in his arms, watching the flicker of light across the screen. "I used to take her to sets," he adds. "She'd walk around like she owned the place." He chuckles. Everyone loved her. She'd talk to the actors, the crew, never shy. I guess that's where she fell in love with the spotlight. This is the part of the story few people know. The early years weren't about struggle, they were about exposure. Meghan wasn't an outsider looking in. She grew up inside the world of performance, of cameras and storytelling. Her father wasn't some distant figure. He was the bridge that connected her to it. Thomas was an Emmy-winning lighting director, a craftsman of light and shadow. He worked on popular shows like Married with Children and General Hospital. To most people, those names are background TV trivia. But to young Meghan, those sets were playgrounds. She'd sit in the audience, eat snacks, and watch me work, he recalls. She saw how the lights made actors glow, how the audience laughed when they were supposed to. She studied people. The irony is painful now. The very man who gave her her first glimpse into show business would later be erased from her Hollywood narrative. She loved it, Thomas says. She was fascinated by it all. The cameras, the sound checks, the rehearsals. It wasn't about fame then, it was curiosity. She was smart, and she soaked everything in. So, where did the story change? When did admiration turn into distance? When did that bright-eyed girl become the woman who wouldn't even pick up her father's calls? Maybe it started with ambition. Thomas remembers Meghan's teenage years, driven, articulate, charming. She was the kind of kid who could talk her way through anything, he says. Teachers loved her. Friends wanted to be around her. She had confidence. He pauses, the smile fading slightly. But she also had that spark, the one that says, "I'm going somewhere bigger than this." That's not arrogance. It's destiny in her eyes. But destiny has a cost. For Meghan, that cost may have been rewriting her past. She didn't like limits, Thomas explains. She didn't like being told no. If she wanted something, she found a way to make it happen. He sighs. That's what I admired about her, and feared. Imagine being a father, watching your child's confidence grow into ambition, and ambition into hunger. You're proud, but you know where that hunger can lead. You've seen it on sets, in the eyes of actors who'd trade anything for the spotlight. Thomas knew it too well. Hollywood eats people alive, he says softly. I thought I could protect her from that. But how do you protect someone who believes she's destined for fame? He tried to give her stability. Private school. Structure. Routine. Immaculate heart. He repeats again, with pride. She was loved there. She did plays, wrote essays, volunteered. She wasn't the poor kid she pretended to be later. She was popular. The contradiction grows sharper with every word. Meghan's own speeches later painted her youth as one of exclusion, of being an outsider in a white environment, of struggling with identity and belonging. But Thomas remembers a different version. She was embraced, he says. She was confident in who she was. Her teachers adored her. She wasn't a victim of her childhood. She was the star of it. It's strange, isn't it? How two people can live the same story but tell it differently. Thomas takes a breath. We used to go to the beach every summer. Just the two of us sometimes. She'd build sandcastles, talk about becoming an actress. I'd tell her she could be anything. She believed me. Maybe too much. There's no bitterness in his tone, just nostalgia. A longing for a simpler time. Before headlines, before betrayal, before silence. She'd bring me drawings, he says. Cards that said, I love you, Daddy. I kept them all. And then his voice cracks, just slightly. I still have them. That's when you realize this story isn't just about deception or fame. It's about love that turned into loss. Because once, Meghan Markle wasn't a symbol, a duchess, or a controversy. She was just a daughter, and Thomas was just her dad. He leans forward, the weight of memory heavy in his voice. People think I'm angry. I'm not. I'm heartbroken. I lost my best friend. The person I used to talk to every day. And I don't even know why. He rubs his temples, the silence between his words saying more than the words themselves. Maybe she thought she had to let go of her old life to become who she wanted to be. Maybe I was part of that old life. That's a chilling thought. That success can demand sacrifice, even of family. Thomas remembers the last time he felt close to her. It was right before she moved to Toronto for Suits, he says. We had dinner. She told me she was finally getting her big break. She was excited, nervous. She said, "Dad, this is my chance." He smiles faintly. I told her I was proud, that I'd always be there for her. And she said, "I know." It's one of those moments that sticks. Because sometimes, when people say, "I know," what they really mean is, "I won't need you anymore." After that, the calls became less frequent. The distance grew. Fame has gravity, and it pulls you away from the people who knew you before it. But even as she rose higher, Thomas cheered her on. He watched her first episodes, saved clippings from magazines, and told friends, "That's my daughter." Pride never left him, not even when pain replaced it. She used to call me her biggest fan, he says. Now, I'm her biggest problem. The sentence lands like a punch. It's a tragic reversal. The father who gave her everything now cast as the obstacle she had to overcome. And yet, deep down, Thomas doesn't hate her for it. I understand the world she's in, he says. They love a story. They don't care if it's true. They want emotion, not accuracy. He chuckles darkly. Guess she learned that better than anyone. Still, there's a pause. But she forgot one thing, he continues. Real stories, the honest ones, don't die. They wait. It's a haunting idea. The truth, waiting quietly behind the curtain, patient, unbothered by fame. Thomas stares out the window. I used to drive her to auditions. She'd sit in the passenger seat, practicing lines. I'd tell her, "You don't have to be perfect. Just be yourself." And she'd laugh. "Dad, being myself doesn't book the job." That line, "being myself doesn't book the job," says it all. Even then, Meghan understood something most people never do. Image is everything. Authenticity is optional. And that's the seed that would grow into the persona the world now knows. Thomas takes a deep breath. She wasn't fake back then, he insists. But she learned early how the world rewards performance. And once you taste that reward, it's hard to stop performing. It's heartbreaking because he's not condemning her. He's describing her evolution. She learned that vulnerability gets applause. That pain makes headlines. That tragedy builds empathy. And so, she turned life into a script. One where she was always the heroine, always misunderstood, always rising above. He exhales. And I guess in that story, there was no room for a father who gave too much. Imagine how that must feel. To watch your child build a public persona that paints you as absent when you were always there. To hear your daughter talk about struggle while you remember the nights you worked double shifts so she'd never know what struggle felt like. It's not just betrayal. It's invisibility. Thomas's voice softens. I don't want to ruin her, he says. I just want the world to know the truth. That she wasn't alone. That she wasn't poor. That she didn't have to pretend. He laughs quietly. If she'd just said, I had a comfortable childhood, and I'm grateful, nobody would have cared. But that's not how Hollywood works. That's not how the royal world works either. They don't want gratitude, they want drama. And drama, Meghan delivered. As Thomas finishes recounting those early years, you can feel the ache between his words. The nostalgia, the disbelief, the love that hasn't quite turned into hate. He looks up finally, his eyes tired. She used to say, Dad, one day I'll make you proud. And she did. I just didn't know it would cost me her. That's the line that breaks the silence. Because no matter what's been said, the interviews, the letters, the accusations, this story still begins with love. But what happens when love becomes competition? When one person's truth threatens another's image? Thomas leans back. She built her story. I built her world. And now, the world only wants to hear hers. He pauses. But that's about to change. And with those words, the air shifts. Because the next part of his story, the part that comes after the laughter, after the childhood memories, isn't nostalgic at all. It's dark, painful, and explosive. Because as Meghan's dreams grew, so did the distance. And soon, She wouldn't just rewrite her childhood. She'd rewrite him out of it completely. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Every dream begins with a spotlight. But in Meghan Markle's case, that light didn't just illuminate, it transformed. Because long before the world knew her as the Duchess of Sussex, she was an actress searching for recognition, hungry for fame, obsessed with image, and already rewriting her life story one interview at a time. Thomas Markle remembers it clearly. The moment Meghan told him she wanted to act. She was about 11, he says softly. She came home from school, stood in the kitchen, and said, "Dad, I'm going to be famous. Not, I want to be, not, I hope to be. Just, I'm going to be." He laughs gently at the memory, but it's tinged with sadness now. "I thought it was cute. You know, every kid dreams like that." But with her, there was something different. It wasn't just a wish, it was a plan. From that day, Meghan began performing, not just on stage, but in life. Every gesture, every story, every conversation started to feel like rehearsal. She had a way of turning everything into a scene, Thomas recalls. If something sad happened, she'd talk about it like a monologue. If something good happened, she'd imagine how it would look in a movie. It wasn't just ambition, it was instinct. She wasn't acting to escape reality. She was acting to control it. When she finally started chasing roles in Hollywood, that instinct turned into survival. Thomas remembers driving her to auditions across Los Angeles. She'd sit in the passenger seat, running her lines, he says. I tried to calm her down, tell her it was just another audition. But she took every single one like it was life or death. That intensity impressed people. Casting agents described her as disciplined, driven, hyper-focused. But to her father, it sometimes felt like obsession. She hated rejection, he says. It wasn't just disappointment. It was personal. Every no was an attack on who she thought she was supposed to be. And that's where the duality began. Meghan, the real person, and Meghan, the character she was crafting for the world. Even at family dinners, Thomas says, she'd tell stories differently depending on who was listening. She'd shift her tone, her expressions. I'd tease her about it. I'd say, "Meg, save it for the camera." And she'd laugh. But she never stopped. It's eerie in hindsight. The girl who could adapt to any situation was learning the art of reinvention, an art she would later perfect on the global stage. Her early acting years were rough, not because of poverty, but because of pressure. Meghan wasn't destitute. She was determined. Thomas continued to support her, paying for acting classes, headshots, and demo reels. She had everything she needed, he says. She just didn't have patience. Hollywood taught her that image was everything. But Meghan didn't just play roles, she began living them. In one audition, she'd be the shy outsider. In another, the confident professional. Soon, those characters started blending into her real life. She'd tell me stories about her day, Thomas says, and sometimes I couldn't tell if they were true. She'd say things that didn't quite match up, but she'd tell them with such conviction that you believed her. That's what made her special and dangerous. He's not being cruel. He's describing a truth many actors know. The line between authenticity and performance is razor thin. And for Meghan, that line eventually disappeared. By her late 20s, she'd learned how to curate her life like a script. Her social media posts were filtered perfection, her interviews polished and precise. Every word was measured, every anecdote designed to paint her as hardworking yet humble. She knew what people wanted to hear, Thomas says. The struggling actress narrative. The girl who made it on her own. The survivor story. She gave it to them perfectly. She always knew how to make herself sound like the underdog. It's a skill, but also a manipulation. Because while she told the world she was scraping by, Thomas was still quietly helping her financially. I wasn't sending her thousands, he clarifies, but I helped when she needed it. Rent, groceries, gas. She never had to go without. So, the question arises again. Why build a brand on struggle when comfort was the truth? Because struggle sells. Pain creates empathy. Audiences fall in love with the idea of resilience. And Meghan understood that better than anyone. She started talking about how hard Hollywood was. Thomas continues. She'd say, "Dad, I can't get a break because I don't fit the mold." And I believed her. I told her to keep trying. But later, I'd see interviews where she'd say she was broke, surviving on next to nothing, that she had no one to turn to. He sighs. I was sitting right there, watching those interviews, thinking, did she forget me? Or did she erase me? That's the pain that never leaves him. Not just being excluded from her fame, but being erased from her struggle. And it's not just Thomas. Friends from Meghan's early years have echoed similar stories of a woman who edited her own history. One friend from acting class once said, Meghan could change her past like most people change outfits. She'd tell one person she grew up middle class, another that she struggled, another that she was privileged. She'd read the room and tell the version that worked. That adaptability made her magnetic. It also made her unpredictable. The turning point came with Suits. The show didn't just make her a recognizable face. It gave her a platform to redefine herself publicly. Suddenly, the girl from California wasn't just an actress. She was a symbol, a woman of color breaking barriers in a white-dominated industry, a feminist icon rising from hardship. It was a powerful story. Except, according to Thomas, it wasn't hers. She told interviewers she paid for her own college, he says, that she worked part-time jobs to make ends meet. But I paid her tuition. I kept every record. She never had student loans. She didn't have to. He pauses, anger creeping into his voice for the first time. She made it sound like I abandoned her, like she had to fight for everything. That's not true. I was there every step of the way, until she decided I wasn't useful anymore. You can almost feel the heartbreak under those words. A father realizing he was written out of his daughter's movie. Because that's what Hollywood became for Meghan, a rehearsal space for life. Every audition, every interview, every role was training for the biggest role she'd ever play, herself. Thomas reflects on one particular day. She came home once after a small part in a show, he recalls. She was upset because her scene got cut. I told her it happens all the time. But she looked at me and said, I just need people to see me. Once they do, I'll never disappear again. That line, I'll never disappear again, feels prophetic now. It wasn't about art. It was about visibility, power, control, the desire to be seen at any cost. That's when Thomas says he began to notice subtle changes. She started talking differently, he says. More polished, more distant, like she was rehearsing an interview instead of having a conversation. Even her gestures changed. Her voice softened in public. Her laugh became lighter, calculated. She used to belly laugh, he says. That real, loud laugh. But later, it turned into that polite smile. The royal one. Even before the royals. The metamorphosis had begun. Meghan was no longer the girl Thomas raised. She was becoming a brand. She learned to curate pain, he says. Not to live it, to present it. To use it when needed. That's a chilling sentence. To curate pain is to wield it as currency. Hollywood gave her the tools to do that. Image control, narrative mastery, selective truth. But it also gave her a taste of what fame could offer: validation, sympathy, and control over her own myth. Thomas lowers his head. I used to think she wanted to act because she loved storytelling. But now I think she wanted to act because she loved control. When you're an actress, you get to decide how people see you. When the real world didn't match what she wanted, she rewrote it. That's what scripted reality means, turning life itself into performance. And it worked. Meghan started landing interviews, shaping her voice as the polished advocate for women, equality, and self-empowerment. But woven into every inspiring speech was a familiar pattern: hardship, struggle, overcoming. It wasn't evil. It was strategic. But strategy has a cost. Because when you build your image on hardship, you need someone to blame for it. And in Meghan's story, that person became her father. Thomas sighs. I started to notice her interviews changed tone. She stopped mentioning me altogether. It was like I didn't exist. And then one day, she said she struggled without parental support. That's when I knew I'd lost her. Not just as a daughter, but as a character in her story. He stares off for a moment. You can't compete with a story that powerful. Nobody wants to hear the dad saying, "That's not true." It sounds bitter. It sounds jealous. So I stayed quiet. But silence only makes the lie louder. It's heartbreaking, but you can see the inevitability of it. Meghan's Hollywood training didn't just make her famous. It taught her how to frame her narrative. And once that narrative was set, truth became irrelevant. By the time she met Harry, Thomas says, she wasn't just acting anymore. She was the character she'd created, the woman who overcame hardship, who rose above it all. But she forgot that real life doesn't have a script. It has consequences. He smiles sadly. I tried to remind her of that once. She told me, Dad, the world believes what it sees, not what it hears. He nods slowly. And she was right. Because what the world saw was a fairy tale, the self-made woman marrying a prince. They didn't see the father who helped her every step of the way. They didn't see Thomas Markle. They only saw the version of him her story required. The absentee dad, the obstacle, the burden. And so, as Meghan's fame soared, Thomas's reputation crumbled, a cruel trade-off that would later explode on a global stage. The actress had become the author of her own myth. And soon, the world would mistake performance for truth. But what came next would prove that even the most carefully written story can collapse when the real world starts asking questions, and no one saw it coming. Every actress dreams of a breakout role. But for Meghan Markle, that role didn't come from Hollywood. It came from royalty. The cameras, the dresses, the global headlines. It wasn't just a love story. It was a rebrand. A transformation from Meghan the struggling actress into Meghan the modern-day princess. But for Thomas Markle, the man who raised her, the fairy tale wasn't about love. It was about strategy, and he saw it long before the world did. He remembers the day he first heard about Harry. I didn't know who he was at first, Thomas admits. She called and said she was seeing someone special. She sounded giddy, like a schoolgirl. Then she said his name, Prince Harry. I thought she was joking. I laughed. She didn't. Thomas leans back, the memory still fresh. I told her, that's big, Meghan. That's not just dating. That's history. And she said, I know. There it was again, that quiet certainty. That same tone she used when she was 11, standing in the kitchen, declaring she'd be famous. Only this time, it wasn't a dream. It was happening. From that moment on, Meghan's life began to change, not just personally, but professionally, publicly, globally. Her social media softened, her interviews became more polished, her wardrobe subtly shifted from trendy to timeless. She started dressing like royalty before she even was one, Thomas recalls. Every move was calculated. This wasn't love at first sight. It was opportunity meeting ambition. She'd always wanted to be known, he says. And when she met Harry, that became her stage. But in Thomas's eyes, the transformation was more than just image. It was identity. She stopped being Meghan Markle the actress, he says. She became Meghan Markle, the brand. He pauses, choosing his words carefully. It's not that she didn't love him, he says. I think she did. But I also think she saw what came with him. She saw the global platform, the influence, the story she could tell. That story, the American girl who married a prince, was too good to resist. It didn't just rewrite her career. It rewrote her entire past. Because suddenly, Meghan's life wasn't about auditions and rejections anymore. It was about destiny, about breaking barriers, defying odds, changing traditions. She wasn't just an actress. She was a symbol. And symbols don't have messy, complicated histories. They have narratives, clean, powerful, and inspiring. And so, the narrative shifted. Thomas shakes his head slowly. That's when she stopped calling as much, he says. She said everything was crazy, that the media was all over her. I understood. But after a while, it felt like she wasn't busy, she was gone. He wasn't invited into her new world. He was edited out. The British tabloids started circling. Meghan became the fresh face of modern royalty, biracial, independent, American. Every headline called her self-made, groundbreaking, the people's duchess. It was the perfect contrast to the traditional image of the monarchy. The palace needed her, and she needed them. It was a mutual trade, Thomas says. She gave them a story. They gave her the crown. But what happens when a story that powerful meets the truth? As Meghan's engagement was announced, Thomas found out the same way the rest of the world did, through the media. No call, no warning. He says quietly. Just headlines. Prince Harry to marry Meghan Markle. I saw my little girl's face on TV, and that's how I found out. His voice trembles, and for a moment, he looks broken. I wasn't angry, he says. I was proud. I was proud, and I cried. I thought she'd call me right after. She didn't. Days turned into weeks. The distance grew. Every time Thomas reached out, the silence grew louder. I kept telling myself she was busy, he says. That it was the media's fault, the palace's fault. But deep down I knew. I'd been written out of the script. And that's what this was, a script. A global spectacle carefully curated for emotional effect. The engagement photos in the garden, the interviews about love at first sight, the talk about shared humanitarian values. Everything was perfectly orchestrated. But one detail didn't fit: Thomas Markle. A retired lighting director living in Mexico didn't suit the royal narrative. Not when you're trying to sell a fairy tale about resilience, grace, and reinvention. She needed a tragic backstory, Thomas says. And what's more tragic than a father who couldn't be there? It made her look stronger. It made people sympathize. But it wasn't true. He shakes his head. I would have been there. I wanted to walk her down the aisle. But she never gave me the chance. The irony, he says, is that the world saw him as the problem, the embarrassing parent. They called me greedy, called me a liar, said I sold her out, he says. But I never wanted money. I wanted my daughter. Imagine that, being turned into the villain in your own child's story. Watching your name dragged through headlines while she rose higher with every tear-filled interview. It wasn't an accident. It was narrative design. Meghan's team, the publicists, the image handlers, knew exactly what they were doing. The estranged father's storyline was perfect. It gave Meghan emotional depth. It turned criticism into cruelty. Who could attack a woman whose father betrayed her? And for Thomas, that betrayal cut both ways. She told people I staged paparazzi photos, he says. That I lied to the press. I did one photo. One, because I was embarrassed about how I looked. I thought it'd make her proud. Instead, she turned it into proof I was the bad guy. It's heartbreaking to hear him say it. Because underneath the resentment is regret. I made a mistake, he admits. But I never deserved to be cut off completely. But the rebrand was already in full swing. The royal wedding was coming, and Meghan's story, her new story, had to be spotless. The public didn't need to see the father who worked nights so she could go to private school. They needed to see the woman who rose above a difficult upbringing. That's how the lie evolved, from exaggeration to foundation. She became the underdog turned duchess, and Thomas became the absent father who didn't understand her world. It was cinematic, heartbreaking, marketable, and it worked. The public devoured it. Social media exploded with praise for Meghan's strength. Headlines called her the modern Cinderella. Every tearful glance, every polished speech added another layer of authenticity to the story. But authenticity can't coexist with omission. Thomas sighs. I watched the wedding on TV, he says quietly. She looked beautiful, perfect. But as she walked down the aisle, all I could think was, that should have been me. I should have been there. He looks away, voice trembling. She didn't even tell me she wasn't going to call. I just found out like everyone else. The silence after that line says more than any words could. Because the rebrand was complete. Meghan Markle had become a royal. But Thomas Markle had become a ghost. The same man who gave her light now watched from the shadows as the world embraced her version of reality. She created a new life, Thomas says. But she buried the old one to do it. It's a haunting statement, and it raises a chilling question. How far will someone go to protect their image once it's built? Thomas sighs deeply. She stopped being Meghan, my daughter. She became Meghan, the message. And that message was clear: resilience, independence, triumph over adversity. It didn't matter if it was true. It just had to be believable. It's almost poetic, in a tragic way. The daughter of a lighting director mastered the art of spotlighting herself and learned how to dim everyone else in the process. But the brighter the spotlight, the darker the shadows behind it. And what was hiding in those shadows, the unspoken truths, the suppressed stories, the broken ties, would soon begin to surface. Because you can rebrand a name, you can edit a photo, you can craft a speech, but you can't rewrite reality forever. The royal romance may have catapulted Meghan into the stratosphere. But for Thomas Markle, it marked the beginning of a different kind of story, one filled with silence, loss, and the painful realization that sometimes love isn't erased by hate, it's erased by ambition. He looks directly into the camera. I don't want revenge, he says quietly. I just want my truth. And my truth doesn't need a crown. The light flickers. The room falls still. And as his words echo, a quiet question fills the air. If the fairy tale was built on fiction, what happens when the truth finally walks in? But what came next would shatter the illusion entirely, and no one saw it coming. Every celebrity knows this one truth. The right story can make the world fall in love with you. and the wrong one can destroy you overnight. Meghan Markle understood this better than most. Because when she crossed from Hollywood to royalty, she didn't just become a duchess. She became a narrative. And the story she told, of a misunderstood, self-made woman fighting against the odds, wasn't just powerful. It was perfectly timed. But behind that sympathetic script was precision. Planning. A performance that Thomas Markle says was as rehearsed as any role she's ever played. She knew what she was doing, Thomas says. Every line, every look, every pause, it was all part of the act. She didn't want the truth. She wanted the version of truth that made her look good. It sounds harsh, but he says it not in anger, but resignation. Because he watched it happen. He watched his daughter become the face of resilience, while the truth, his truth, was quietly buried beneath polished headlines. Let's rewind. In the early days of Meghan's royal fame, she was a media darling. The American actress who captured a prince's heart. The modern outsider who breathed life into a centuries-old monarchy. But as the fairy tale played out, the public's fascination turned to scrutiny. Questions about her past began to surface. Family tensions, old photos, contradictions in her backstory. And that's when the sympathy campaign began. Meghan didn't retreat. She reframed. She became the misunderstood woman, the target of tabloid cruelty, the victim of racism, betrayal, and loneliness. The world watched her tearful interviews, her soft, deliberate pauses, her careful choice of words, every moment designed to invite empathy and redirect blame. It was brilliant, manipulative, effective. She knew the press, Thomas explains. She'd worked with them before. She knew how stories are written, how sympathy spreads. She used it. Every time she looked vulnerable, the world came to her defense. He sighs. It was like watching someone weaponize pain. The first wave of her media makeover painted her as a woman abandoned by her father. The headline screamed it, Meghan's heartbreak. A strange dad speaks to the press. The letter she never wanted the world to see, Duchess betrayed. Thomas says those headlines were deliberate. She didn't want to answer questions about her family, so she turned me into the problem. It made her look strong, and me look cruel. He shakes his head slowly. She said I sold her out. But what did I sell? My love, my story, my side. There's pain in his tone, the kind that comes from being misrepresented by someone you raised to tell the truth. She told the world I didn't help her, that I embarrassed her. But I was the one paying her bills, sending her money. I have the receipts. Literally. But facts don't sell. Feelings do. And that's the real key to Meghan's media mastery. She didn't argue with facts. She replaced them with feelings. Every interview she gave was emotional architecture. She didn't attack, she implied. She didn't accuse, she described. She let the audience connect the dots. She learned that trick early, Thomas says. You don't have to lie directly. You just have to tell the truth carefully. Leave out the parts that don't serve you. It's a subtle form of control, and Meghan wielded it flawlessly. Remember the interviews where she spoke about making her own way or being cut off from her family? She never named her father as the villain outright. She didn't need to. The emotion in her voice did the work for her. She knew exactly how to sound sincere, Thomas says. The tremble in her voice, the look down, the quiet sigh. I used to tell her she'd make a great director someday. I didn't realize she'd direct her own life story. And the public, they believed every frame. The sympathy narrative worked because it appealed to something universal, the desire to root for the underdog. The girl who wasn't supposed to make it. The woman fighting against a cruel world. She became untouchable, Thomas says bitterly. Because if you questioned her, you weren't just questioning her. You were attacking every woman who's ever been hurt, every daughter who's ever been misunderstood. It's hard to argue with that logic. Meghan's team built an emotional fortress around her image, and Thomas was left on the outside, shouting into a storm that refused to listen. He recalls watching her first big post-royal interview. I sat there, watching her cry on television, talking about how lonely she felt, how nobody helped her. And all I could think was, I helped you. I was there. You just stopped answering the phone. He pauses, his voice trembling. That broke me. Because she wasn't just talking to the world. She was talking to me. And she knew it. There's something painfully theatrical about that. A daughter performing her pain for millions, while the man she's portraying as absent watches from afar. But Meghan's sympathetic script wasn't just about her father. It extended to her life inside the palace. She became the outsider, the misunderstood American navigating a cold, outdated system. Every story reinforced the same theme. She's trying her best, but the world is against her. It was the same narrative she'd built in Hollywood, repackaged for royalty. She turned the palace into another studio, Thomas says. Only this time, the stakes were higher. The world wasn't watching a show. They were watching her life. And it worked. Every photo of her holding Harry's hand tightly, every shot of her wiping a tear, every interview line that began with "it wasn't easy." It all drew people in. But sympathy is a double-edged sword. Once you build your power on pain, you have to keep the pain coming. That's where the contradictions began to appear. Meghan's claims about her struggles didn't always align with the facts. Stories about financial hardship clashed with evidence of her father's support. Her talk of isolation contradicted reports of lavish homes and global friendships. She told the world she was silenced, Thomas says. But I saw her speaking louder than ever. He smiles bitterly. She says she didn't feel protected. I wasn't protected either, not from her lies. It's not just a father's bitterness, it's disbelief. The kind of disbelief that comes when you watch someone rewrite the truth so skillfully that even you begin to doubt your own memories. Thomas recalls the first time he realized how deep the transformation had gone. She sent me a letter, he says. It was cold, polite, like a lawyer wrote it. It said she needed space. But what it really meant was, stay silent. And he did, for a while, until silence became suffocation. I couldn't watch anymore, he says. The world was calling me a monster. People believed I abandoned her. And she never corrected it. The pain in his voice turns to resolve. That's when I decided, if she can tell her story, I can tell mine. He knows how it sounds. Bitter, defensive. But in his mind, it's justice. Because what the world didn't know was that Meghan's truth had been tested and rewritten again and again. Her team managed her narrative with surgical precision. They knew which publications to leak to, which journalists to trust, which stories to amplify. She always had control, Thomas insists. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. She wasn't the victim of the media. She used it better than anyone. And that's where the contradiction lies. The same woman who claimed she was hunted by tabloids was also feeding them stories when it served her. She learned early that you don't fight the media, Thomas says. You feed it. You just make sure you're the one holding the spoon. He leans back, weary. She's not the first person to do it. But she's the best I've ever seen. And maybe that's the tragedy, because for all her manipulation, there's brilliance in it. Meghan Markle mastered a craft few can control, the art of making the world care. But at what cost? Thomas looks down, his voice soft now. I used to call her my miracle. Now she's my mystery. He shakes his head. The woman I raised wouldn't have done this. But maybe she always wanted to be someone else. That's the question that haunts him, and maybe the audience too. Was Meghan always like this, or did fame make her this way? She used to be warm, he says. She used to call me just to talk. Now every word she says sounds rehearsed. Every smile looks rehearsed. She used to have joy. Now she has purpose. And that's not the same thing. He pauses, long enough for the silence to speak for him. She thinks she's controlling the story. But the truth doesn't go away. It waits. It watches. It remembers. And Thomas, it seems, remembers everything. He looks directly into the camera. People think I'm trying to hurt her. I'm not. I'm just trying to stop pretending. Because the sympathetic script Meghan built was flawless, but all scripts eventually end. And when they do, what's left is the person behind the performance. Thomas leans forward, his face heavy with years of regret. She told the world she was alone, he says. But she's the one who made herself that way. He takes a breath. She said she didn't have anyone to rely on. But I was there. I've always been there. She just stopped looking. And that's the cruel irony. The woman who begged the world to believe her pain created it herself, by cutting off the one man who would have done anything to protect her. The interview ends. The lights fade. The silence lingers. But this isn't the end of the story. It's only the middle. Because Thomas is about to show the world something Meghan's team never wanted revealed, the tangible proof behind his claims. Receipts, records, reality. And once those surface, the sympathy story begins to crack. Because the truth doesn't cry. It doesn't beg. It doesn't perform. It simply waits for the lights to go out, and then it walks in. But what Thomas reveals next will tear the mask off the narrative. And no one saw it coming. Every successful myth needs a clean beginning. No clutter, no contradictions, just the perfect starting point. A story the audience can hold on to. Meghan Markle understood that better than anyone.